Ezra James Coldwell had been working cattle for 41 years. He was 64 years old, and he had started at 14 with his grandfather on 40 acres in Grady County, Oklahoma, and had not stopped. His grandfather's name was Robert James Coldwell, and he had been a cattleman in Grady County for 50 years. And he had started Ezra at 14, not because he needed the labor, though he did, but because he believed that the knowledge could not be transmitted in words alone, that it had to be acquired in the field through repetition and observation across seasons. He had said, "You cannot learn cattle from a book. You can learn about cattle from a book. The cattle will tell you what you need to know if you pay attention long enough to hear it." Ezra had paid attention. He had paid attention for 50 years. He had worked ranches in Oklahoma and in Texas and in New Mexico, starting on his grandfather's 40 acres and moving to a larger operation in Stevens County when he was 22, and then to a feedlot operation in the Texas Panhandle when he was 31, and then back to cow-calf ranching when he was 37, because the feedlot scale had not suited him too much distance between the individual animal and the person tending it too much commodity thinking, and not enough animal thinking. He had gone back to what he knew, and had worked 2 smaller ranches in the hill country before Dale Whitmore found him. For the last 19 years, he had been the head ranch hand at Coldwater Creek Ranch, which was 1,100 acres in the hill country of central Texas, owned by a man named Dale Whitmore, who had bought the ranch 22 years ago and had hired Ezra 3 years later and had not looked back. Dale Whitmore was 68 and did not know cattle the way Ezra knew cattle, and had never pretended to. He had bought the ranch as a land investment and had decided to run cattle on it because the land supported cattle and because he had grown up watching ranchers and had always believed he would have a ranch someday, which he did. And the belief and the reality had met in the specific way they meet when a person of means buys a thing without quite knowing what the thing demands of you. What it demanded was Ezra. Dale had figured that out in the first year and had hired accordingly. He knew land, and he knew money, and he knew that the man who knew cattle was the most important person on the ranch, and he paid Ezra accordingly and gave him the authority to make the decisions that needed to be made on a daily basis without consulting anyone. Ezra's wife Marlene had been a school administrator for 32 years in the county school district and had retired 2 years ago. She knew ranching the way someone who has lived on a ranch for 19 years knows it. She could look at the weather and know what it meant for the herd. She could look at the pasture and know it needed attention. She could read Ezra's assessment of a sale without asking him to explain it. She had her own professional vocabulary and her own way of reading situations, and it was not the same as his, and they had not needed it to be. She sat at the kitchen table with him on the evenings he came back from sales, and he told her what had happened, and she listened, and occasionally asked a question that showed she had been listening to more than the surface of what he said. Ezra James Coldwell knew cattle. He knew their weight by standing next to them in a field, not by formula, but by the specific, calibrated sense that 50 years of handling cattle in every condition had developed in him, the way a craftsman knows dimension before the measure is taken. The way a person who has been doing one thing well for long enough stops needing the instrument and becomes the instrument. He had not needed a scale in the field in 20 years. He had not needed a price sheet in the auction ring in 15. He knew what he knew because he had been paying attention for 50 years, and the knowledge had settled into him the way things settle when you give them enough time and enough honest attention. He knew their health by watching them move in the morning in the first 20 minutes after they came off the night's rest, when the body was honest and the problems showed themselves if you were paying the right kind of attention. He knew the price they would bring at auction before the auction happened because he knew what the market was doing and he knew what the cattle were. And he knew what the room in that barn would pay for cattle of that quality on that sale day. He knew when a rancher was asking too much and when a buyer was offering too little, and he had opinions about both that he kept to himself unless asked, and when asked, he gave them directly and backed them with the evidence that was in front of both of them if they were looking at the same thing. He knew how to read the room at an auction ring the way other people read a newspaper, without effort, with complete comprehension, with the specific certainty of a person who has been reading the same thing for a very long time, and for whom the meaning was never obscure. This was not a talent. It was 41 years of paying attention, and the debt it owed his grandfather, who had started him at 14, and had not stopped teaching him until he was 31. And his grandfather was 81, and they were standing in a field in Grady County looking at a cow that his grandfather said had 3 weeks left. And she had had 3 weeks left, and his grandfather had said, "Now you know." Ezra had said, "I already knew." His grandfather had said no. Now you know that you know. That is a different thing. He had been going to the Redbud County Livestock Auction for 11 years, since Dale Whitmore had moved his selling operation there from a smaller regional sale barn that had closed. The Redbud County sale ran every other Thursday and sold cattle and goats and the occasional horse lot, and it was the most important sale barn in the county for beef cattle, and had been for 20 years. Ezra had sold through Redbud County for 11 years, and had bought through Redbud County for 8 of those years, beginning when Dale Whitmore had decided to expand the cow-calf operation and had given Ezra a buying budget and the authority to use it at his professional discretion. The sale barn had a long concrete auction ring and tiered seating around it, and a narrow aisle that ran behind the highest row of seats, and buyers sat in the seats and raised their hands when the price moved through a point they wanted, and the auctioneer tracked the bids from the podium, and the ringmen moved through the crowd pointing and nodding and confirming bids in the rapid back and forth that an auction required. The ringman's job was to find the next bid before the auctioneer ran out of room to move the price, which meant reading the crowd continuously, knowing who was in and who was out, watching the hands and the tilted chins and the particular stillness of a buyer who was at his limit, but had not declared it yet. It was a skilled and physical job done at speed in a loud room, and the best ringmen had been doing it for decades and could read a crowd the way Ezra could read a herd, continuously, incrementally, without missing what mattered. Ezra had sat in those seats for 11 years. He knew the ringmen by name. He knew Roy Pittman, the auctioneer, who had been calling sales at Redbud County for 17 years by the sound of his voice from the parking lot before he went inside. He knew the rhythm of a Redbud County sale, which lots moved fast and which moved slow, which cattle the buyers came for and which they let pass, what a morning crowd could do and what an afternoon crowd was likely to do, and how the weather affected the room. He knew the price a well-regarded rancher's cattle should bring, and he knew when the bidding fell short of what the cattle were worth, which sometimes happened for legitimate reasons, buyer composition, seasonal supply, and which sometimes happened for reasons that required a closer look. He had a specific seat in the front section that he had used for 8 years, a seat from which he could see the ring and the cattle as they came in, and the other buyer's hands simultaneously, which was the information he needed to buy well. From that seat he could do his job. From the outer rows he could not do his job as well, and he knew the difference, and when he was directed to the outer rows for the first time in February, he had noted the difference and had thought about it on the drive home. The trouble started when a new sale manager came in. His name was Chet Brandeis, and he was 37 years old, and had come from a sale barn operation in a larger city where he had managed livestock transactions at a higher volume, but a different kind. Feedlot cattle commodity buying the industrial scale that processed large numbers of uniform lots efficiently, and that was a genuinely different enterprise from the hill country rancher-to-rancher market that Redbud County served. At a large feedlot sale, the buyers were institutional, and the cattle were fungible, and the relationships were transactional in the commercial sense. At Redbud County, the buyers were mostly regional ranchers who knew each other and knew the sellers, and who had opinions about specific bloodlines and specific ranching operations going back decades. The barn ran on reputation. The relationships were the product. Brandeis had not grown up in the hill country. He had not been around when Calvin Obie's cattle had averaged a premium for the past 14 years. He had not been in the ring when James Treadwell's Angus lots had brought their price against the better-known operations because everyone at the barn knew what a Treadwell calf looked like by the time it hit the ring. He had looked at the barn from the outside and seen an operation that could be made more efficient, and he had been right about some of it, and he had brought a framework that was correct for a barn he had worked in before and that did not fit the barn he had just arrived at. He had been brought in by the sale barn's owner, a man named Gerald Farr, who had wanted to modernize the operation and had believed that Brandeis could bring efficiency to a barn that had been running on tradition and personal relationship for 2 decades. Gerald Farr was not wrong that some modernization was needed. He had not anticipated that the person he hired to modernize it would also disrupt the things that did not need to be disrupted. Brandeis had arrived in January. He had made changes. Some of them were sensible. The consignment tracking software was genuinely outdated, and the new system was better, and the arrangement with the feed supplier was more efficient in the new configuration. Some of the changes were less clearly improvements. He had rearranged the seating allocation at the ring, reserving the front rows for what he called registered buyers, which in practice meant buyers who had filled out a new registration form he had instituted, and which in practice meant that buyers who had been attending the sale for years and had not been asked to fill out any form were now being directed away from their usual seats when they arrived. He had also implemented a new lot sequencing protocol that changed the order in which consignors' cattle came through the ring with the stated rationale of grouping similar animals for buyer convenience and which had the effect of moving certain lots from the morning sale, when buyers were most plentiful and most competitive, to the afternoon sale, when the room was thinner. Ezra had been directed away from his usual seat 3 times in February and March. On the first occasion, he had been approached at the entrance to the seating area by a ringman he had not seen before, a young man who was clearly new and who was following instructions he had been given and had been told that the front section was reserved for registered buyers and that he would need to fill out a registration card. Ezra had said, "I have been buying at this barn for 8 years. The ringman said, "I understand. It is a new procedure." Ezra had taken the card. He had filled it out with his name and his operation and his purchase history. He had been told his registration was being processed. He had sat in the outer rows and had watched the sale from a position that was adequate and not the position he needed. He had sat in the outer rows and thought about what he was seeing. He had looked at the front section. He had noted who was sitting there, the buyers who had always sat there, the buyers he had been bidding against for 8 years, the buyers whose hands he knew and whose patterns he understood. They were in their seats. He was in the back. He had thought about this for the duration of the sale and had come to no conclusion he was prepared to act on yet. He had filed the observation. He was methodical. He had come back the following sale and been told the registration was still processing and had again sat in the outer rows. He had looked at the front section again. The same buyers were there. He had noted the absence of any similar buyer he could see who was sitting in the outer rows due to registration processing. He had thought about this for the duration of the sale. On the 3rd occasion in March, he had asked Chet Brandeis directly when the registration would be complete. He had waited at the end of the sale and had found Brandeis near the consignment office and had introduced himself and had said, "My name is Ezra Coldwell. I manage cattle purchasing for Coldwater Creek Ranch. I have been buying at this sale for 8 years. I have had a registration application processing for the past 2 sales, and I would like to understand the timeline." Brandeis had looked at him with the expression of a person who was accustomed to setting timelines rather than being asked about them. He said, "These things take time. It is a background check process. We take buyer qualifications seriously." Ezra had said, "What specifically is being checked, and can you give me an estimated completion date?" Brandeis had said, "I am not in a position to give specific timelines." Ezra had said, "Who can I speak to about the process?" Brandeis had said, "I am the person you speak to." Ezra had walked to his truck. He had sat for a moment in the parking lot. He had thought about what he knew and what he did not know, and what the gap between those two things most likely contained. Then he called Dale Whitmore. He described the 3 incidents in sequence: the first registration request in February, the outer row seating at the first and second sales, the conversation with Brandeis, the specific words Brandeis had used. He described what he had observed about the front section, the buyers who were there, the absence of any other buyers he could identify who were in his situation. Dale had listened to all of it. He said, "Have you noticed whether other established buyers have had the same issue?" Ezra said, "I have not observed that. I have not been able to compare notes with other buyers, because the situation is not one you easily bring up in a crowd. But I have not seen another established buyer sitting in the outer rows for registration processing," Dale said. "I will call Gerald Farr." Dale called Gerald Farr, and Gerald Farr said he would look into it. Gerald Farr called Brandeis. Brandeis said the registration process was standard and would be complete within the next sales cycle. He said it was being applied consistently. He said Ezra's file had a processing delay that was not uncommon. Gerald Farr had relayed this to Dale. Dale had relayed it to Ezra. Ezra had said, "That is what I expected him to say. I will be at the next sale." The next sale cycle came. Ezra sat in the outer rows. His registration was still processing. In April, Ezra submitted a formal complaint through the Texas Department of Agriculture's livestock market complaint process. He had researched the complaint process over the course of a weekend, identifying the correct channel, the required documentation, and the specific information the complaint needed to contain to be actionable. He was methodical about this, the way he was methodical about everything that required correct execution. He gathered the information he needed before he began, so that the thing he produced was complete when it was filed and did not require follow-up requests for information that should have been included at the start. The complaint described the 4 incidents in sequence. The first registration request in February. The outer row seating at the first and second sales, the conversation with Chet Brandeis in March, and the 4th sale in April, where the registration was still processing. It included the specific dates and the names of the Sunrise Gardens staff he had spoken to and the exact language Brandeis had used when Ezra had asked about the timeline. It noted that he had been an active buyer at the barn for 8 years with a purchasing history that could be verified through the barn's own consignment and buyer records, and that he had not been informed of any background concern with his purchasing activity at any point in those 8 years. The complaint also noted that he had not observed any other established buyers being directed from their usual seating positions during the same period. The 5th paragraph said, "I am requesting that any prior complaints about the buyer registration process or buyer seating at Redbud County Livestock Auction be identified and reviewed, and that those complaints, if they exist, be assessed in the context of one another rather than individually." Individual review of complaints about a process issue may not reveal the pattern that the complaints collectively represent. If multiple buyers have had similar experiences, the pattern is the most important information available. He filed the complaint on a Tuesday. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at it once more before he submitted it. He thought about the 5th paragraph. He had written it from one direction only, which was his professional knowledge of how patterns worked, and how individual data points required aggregation to show what they meant. He did not know about Calvin Obie's February complaint, or Dorothy Reyes's March complaint, or James Treadwell's April complaint when he filed his own in April. He did not know he was the 4th. He only knew that what was happening to him was unlikely to be unique, and that the question to ask was whether anyone had been required to look for the others. He submitted the complaint. He sent a copy to Dale Whitmore. He sent a copy to Gerald Farr. Gerald Farr received the complaint on Wednesday morning and read it that afternoon. He was 63 years old and had owned the Redbud County sale barn for 18 years and had been in the livestock industry for 34 years. He had hired Chet Brandeis because he had wanted to modernize, not because he had wanted to change who felt welcome at his barn. He read the complaint twice. He read the 5th paragraph carefully. He picked up the phone and called his assistant and said, "Pull the complaint log for the last 2 years, all of it." There were 3 prior complaints. The first had been filed in February, 6 weeks after Brandeis arrived, by a rancher named Calvin Obie, who raised Angus cattle on 300 acres in the northeast part of the county. Calvin Obie was black and 61 years old, and he had been selling through Redbud County for 14 years. He had arrived at the February sale and been told by a ringman that his seller's position had been moved to a different pen sequence, which had placed his cattle later in the sale order and had resulted in a lower average price because the afternoon buyers were a thinner crowd than the morning crowd. He had asked for the reason and been told it was a new sequencing protocol. He had filed a complaint with the barn directly. The complaint had been reviewed by the barn's operations coordinator and responded to with a note that the sequencing protocol was under review. Calvin Obie had been at every sale since, but had noticed that his cattle continued to be placed in the afternoon sequence. The second complaint had been filed in March by a woman named Dorothy Reyes, a rancher who raised Angus cross cattle on 540 acres, and who was black and 58 years old, and who had been buying and selling at Redbud County for 9 years. She had been directed away from her usual buyer's seat at 2 consecutive sales and had been told her buyer registration was under review. She had filed the complaint directly with the barn and received a response identical in language to Calvin Obie's "the matter was under review." The third complaint had been filed in April, 2 weeks before Ezra's complaint, by a man named James Treadwell Black, 66 years old, who had been a seller at Redbud County for 22 years and whose cattle were known at the barn as some of the most consistent beef producer in the county. He had been assigned a new lot number sequence in March that placed his cattle consistently after the midpoint of the sale, which reduced his average price. He had asked for the reason and received no satisfactory answer, and had filed a complaint with Gerald Farr directly, which had been forwarded to Brandeis, who had responded with a note that lot sequencing was based on consignment timing and arrival logistics. Gerald Farr read all 4 complaints on Wednesday afternoon. He read them in the order they were filed. Calvin Obie's February complaint, Dorothy Reyes's March complaint, James Treadwell's April complaint, Ezra Coldwell's April complaint. He read them slowly and without looking away from any of them. He had been in the livestock business for 34 years, and he had owned this barn for 18 of those years, and he had believed for those 18 years that the barn ran on fairness, that the price a rancher's cattle brought was the price the room would give them, and that the room gave everyone the same opportunity. He had believed this. He had built the barn's reputation on it. The barn's reputation was real. It was one of the most well-regarded sale operations in the region. But the reputation had been built before January, and between January and this Wednesday afternoon in May, while the reputation was still holding, the barn itself had been doing something different. He read the 4 complaints together for the first time. All 4 complainants were black ranchers and livestock buyers with long histories at the barn. All 4 had been affected by changes implemented after Chet Brandeis's arrival. All 4 had filed complaints that had been answered with identical language, "The matter is under review," and no action. None of the complaints had been read alongside the others until Ezra's 5th paragraph had asked for exactly that. He sat at his desk for a long time after reading them. Then he called his attorney. He called Roy Pittman, who had been calling sales at his barn for 17 years, and who would have an opinion about this. He called his most trusted ringman, a 40-year veteran named Earl Doss, who had been at the barn since before Gerald bought it, and who knew everything that happened in the ring, and most of what happened outside it. He said to Earl, "I need you to come in. Not tomorrow, today." Earl came. He sat across from Gerald's desk. Gerald showed him the 4 complaints. Earl read them. Gerald said, Have you noticed what has been happening to the seating and the lot placement since January? Earl looked at him steadily. He said yes. I have noticed. Gerald said, why did you not tell me? Earl was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of a man who had worked in the same place for a long time, and who had learned over that time when to speak and when to wait. He said, I thought you knew. Gerald said I did not know. Earl said I understand. Gerald said, tell me what you have seen. Earl told him. It took 25 minutes. At the end of it, Gerald said thank you. Earl said I should have told you sooner. Gerald said yes. But you are telling me now. Gerald Farr called Chet Brandeis into his office on Thursday morning. He had the 4 complaints printed and arranged in the order they were filed. Calvin Obie's February complaint, Dorothy Reyes's March complaint, James Treadwell's April complaint, Ezra Coldwell's April complaint. He had the access and registration logs from the same period. He had Earl Doss's account from the night before. He had spent the morning organizing what he knew before the conversation, which was a method he used when the conversation required precision. He showed Brandeis the 4 complaints and the logs. He said these are 4 complaints from 4 established customers. They are all black. They were all filed between February and April. There are no complaints from any non-black customers about seating or lot sequencing during the same period. The lot sequencing records show that 3 of these 4 ranchers' cattle were moved to afternoon slots after January. The registration records show that 2 buyers had registration holds that were not resolved for 6 or more sales. I want you to explain to me what has been happening. Brandeis said the registration process is standard. It is applied to all new or unverified buyers. The sequencing is based on logistics grouping similar animals for buyer convenience and efficient sale flow. Gerald said of the 7 buyers with registration applications in the file, 6 are black. 1 is not black. The 1 non-black application was processed in 4 days. The 6 black applications average 47 days. That is not standard. 2 are still marked processing as of this week. As for the sequencing, the logistics you are describing produced lower prices for 4 black ranchers, whose cattle are among the best regarded in this county, and who had been bringing morning slot prices for years before January. Calvin Obie's morning slot average declined 14% in 4 months. That is not buyer convenience. That is a cost that Calvin Obie paid. Brandeis said the sequencing criteria are applied without regard to the consignor. Gerald said the results say otherwise. Brandeis did not respond. Gerald Farr placed Chet Brandeis on administrative leave that afternoon, effective immediately pending a formal review. He called an independent livestock market consultant, a woman named Patricia Solis, who had been doing fair market audits for 15 years and who knew livestock market procedure and what deviation from procedure looked like in the records. He contracted her for an immediate and comprehensive review. He called all 4 complainants personally over the course of Thursday afternoon and Friday morning. He called Ezra last. He had already called Calvin Obie and Dorothy Reyes and James Treadwell in the order they had filed their complaints. He said to each of them the same things I read all 4 complaints together this morning. I should have read them together before. The staff member responsible is on leave pending review. A consultant will begin work Monday. You will hear from me with findings and a plan. I am sorry for what happened at this barn. Calvin Obie had said my cattle are going to be in the morning slot. It was not a question. Gerald had said yes. They are going back to the morning slot immediately. Calvin had said you know what 14 years of that average looks like. Gerald had said I am learning. Calvin had said good. James Treadwell had said nothing for a long moment after Gerald explained what the review had found. Then he said, 22 years. I have been selling here for 22 years. Gerald said, I know. I know your operation. I know your cattle. That is not what this barn does. Treadwell said it is what it did for 4 months. Gerald said yes. It is what it did for 4 months, and I am going to make that accountable. Treadwell said I will wait to hear what right looks like. He called Ezra last. He said I read your complaint and I read the 3 prior complaints this morning. I should have read them together before. Your 5th paragraph is why I am calling. Ezra said, have you spoken to the other 3? Gerald said yes. I have called all 4 of you today. Ezra said Calvin Obie has been in that afternoon slot since February. Gerald said I know. I am going to fix that immediately before the next sale. Ezra said, and the price he did not get. Gerald said I intend to address that. The consultant's work will tell me what the number is. I will make him whole on the number the consultant identifies. I am going to make this right. Ezra said how. Gerald said the consultant starts Monday. She will tell me what right looks like in the records and in the numbers, and I will do what she says. Ezra said, that is the right answer. Gerald said, your 5th paragraph was the right question. Ezra said, the 5th paragraph asked what should have been asked in February. Gerald said yes. It should have. Ezra said, now it has been asked. Gerald said yes. Now it has been answered. Patricia Solis arrived at Redbud County Livestock Auction on a Monday morning and sat up at a table in the consignment office and began requesting records. She had been doing fair market audits for 15 years, and she had the specific patience of someone who has spent 15 years reading records that were not organized the way she would have organized them, finding what was there and noting what was missing and building a picture from the available evidence without filling the gaps with assumptions she could not support. She requested consignment records going back 2 years. Lot sequencing data for the same period buyer registration files, seating assignment logs, price records for individual consignors, and the correspondence file for all barn-level complaints. She spent 3 weeks. She compared patterns before Brandeis's arrival in January and after. She pulled the average prices for each of the 5 complainants' cattle lots in the 12 months before January and the 4 months after. She pulled the same data for a comparison group of non-black consignors with comparable tenure. She mapped the morning versus afternoon slot assignments across all consignors for the same 2 periods. She presented her findings to Gerald Farr in the 3rd week of May. She presented them in writing 12 pages with a summary and a data appendix and 4 specific findings and 5 specific recommendations. The findings: 5 black ranchers and buyers with established records at the barn had been disadvantaged in lot sequencing or buyer registration, or both, since January in a pattern that was consistent across all 5 and inconsistent with how the barn had operated for the prior decade. No non-black ranchers or buyers with comparable tenure records had experienced comparable disruption. The lot sequencing changes had produced quantifiable price impacts for 3 of the 5 affected parties across 21 sales. Calvin Obie's morning slot average had declined by 14% since January. James Treadwell's by 11%, and Dorothy Reyes's selling price per hundredweight had declined 8% against a county average that had been stable. The buyer registration process as implemented had no written qualifying criteria, no documented basis for hold decisions, and no consistent application to non-black buyers. Of 7 buyers whose registration applications were in the file, 6 were black. Of the 1 non-black buyer whose application was in the file, the application had been processed in 4 days. The average processing time for the 6 black buyers' applications was 47 days, with 2 still listed as processing on the date Brandeis was placed on leave. She also found that all 4 complaints had been resolved individually at the barn level without any cross-referencing and without escalation. The individual resolutions had been identical in language. The matter is under review. No action had followed any of the resolutions. The complaint file had not been organized in a way that made cross-referencing easy or natural. The complaints had been logged by date and by consignor or buyer name, but not by the name of the staff member involved, which meant that Chet Brandeis's name did not appear in a way that would have connected the 4 complaints to a common source without someone specifically looking for the connection. The 5th paragraph of Ezra Coldwell's complaint to the Texas Department of Agriculture had been the first external escalation and the first request for sequential review of all complaints together. The 5th paragraph had asked whether the prior complaints had been reviewed in the context of each other. They had not been. When they were, the picture took 3 weeks to document fully and 40 minutes to explain to Gerald Farr, who had sat across from Patricia Solis's table and listened to all of it and had not interrupted except to ask clarifying questions. Gerald Farr terminated Chet Brandeis's employment. He issued a written notice to all 5 affected parties, including Calvin Obey, Dorothy Reyes, James Treadwell, Ezra Coldwell, and a 5th affected party. The review had identified a woman named Laura Washington Black, 53 years old, who raised commercial Angus cattle on 220 acres in the south part of the county, who had been selling at Redbud County for 6 years, and who had not filed a complaint. She had not filed a complaint because she had not known she could. She had noticed the afternoon slot placement and had believed it was logistics and had adjusted her calendar to stay for the afternoon sales, which she found inconvenient but not actionable. The consultant's analysis had identified her lot assignments as part of the same pattern. Gerald Farr called her on a Friday morning and explained what the review had found, and that her cattle had been placed in the afternoon sequence for 4 months without a legitimate logistical basis. She said, "I did not know I could file a complaint about lot sequencing." He said, "You can. You always could." She said, "How would I have known that?" He said, "We are going to make that clearer. The barn is posting a notice at the consignment desk that describes the complaint process and what it covers." She said, "Is the price adjustment real?" He said, "Yes. The consultant calculated your losses against your 12-month prior average, and the settlement reflects that number." She said, "I appreciate that. And I appreciate the call." He said, "You should have had this call in January." She said, "Yes. But you are making it now." He said, "Yes, I am." He offered a price adjustment settlement to the 3 ranchers who had suffered quantifiable auction losses. He implemented new procedures, all lot sequencing to be governed by a written protocol with documented criteria, buyer registration to have a written timeline and written criteria with no discretionary holds, all barn complaints to be reviewed sequentially at the threshold of 2 complaints involving any common element. He also made a public statement to the Redbud County sale barn customers. He did not send a letter, and he did not post a notice. He stood at the podium before the first sale after the changes in the space where Roy Pittman usually stood, and he waited until the room was settled and the buyers and consignors and ringmen and staff had gone quiet, and then he spoke. He said, "Some of you have been treated unfairly at this barn since January. That is not what this barn has been, and it is not what it is going to be. I did not catch it fast enough, and I am responsible for that. When I did catch it, because Ezra Coldwell filed a complaint that asked the right question, and I read the prior complaints together for the first time, I moved as fast as I could to fix it. But fast is not the same as soon, and soon enough would have been before any of this happened. I am sorry for what happened. I am sorry for the prices that were not what they should have been, and for the seats that were not where they should have been, and for the time that was lost. This barn has operated on trust for 34 years, and it will continue to operate on trust. That is the only business I know how to do." The room was quiet when he finished. Then Roy Pittman, who had been calling sales at Redbud County for 17 years, and who had watched everything that had happened since January with the specific distress of a man who loved the barn and the people in it, and who had not known what to do about what he was seeing, and who had told Earl Doss in February that something was wrong, and who had not taken the next step, was standing to the right of the podium. He had listened to Gerald's statement with the specific attention of a man who is hearing something he has been waiting to hear said out loud. He nodded once. He picked up his microphone. He looked out at the ring and at the buyers in their seats, and at the ring men in their positions, and at the first lot of cattle being loaded into the chute, and he said, "First lot of the day." And the sale began the way it was supposed to begin. Ezra Coldwell sat in his usual seat in the front section. His registration had been processed the morning before the sale when Gerald Farr's assistant had called to confirm and had said, "Your registration is complete, Mr. Coldwell, and your usual seat in the front section is yours." He had thanked her and hung up and had told Marlene. Marlene had said good. He had said yes. He had not said anything else because the registration being processed was not the thing he was thinking about. He was thinking about Calvin Obie's cattle sitting in the afternoon slot for 4 months and the price that Calvin Obie's cattle had not brought because the afternoon room was thin. He sat where he had sat for 8 years before January and watched the first lot come through the ring. The first lot was a group of Angus Cross steers from a rancher he knew named Henderson who ran 200 acres in the west part of the county. The steers were good cattle and the room was full, and the bidding went the way bidding goes when the room is full and the cattle are good quickly with multiple hands and 2 ringmen working simultaneously, the price moving in the rhythm that Roy Pittman established and maintained with the specific authority of 17 years behind the microphone. Ezra watched the price and watched the hands and made his notes in the small notebook he carried to every sale. Calvin Obie was 3 seats to his left. His cattle were in the morning sequence. They had always been morning sequence cattle for 14 years because his cattle were known at this barn, and the buyers who knew them came in the morning, and that was when the price was right. He had lost 4 months of morning slot prices. He was in the morning slot again. He watched his lot come through with the expression of a man who has been watching this barn for 14 years and who knows what a morning slot sale looks like and what it means. Dorothy Reyes was in the upper section where she preferred to sit because she liked the full view of the ring, not just the cattle, but the buyers, the hands, the movement of the room as a price developed. She had a coffee and a small notebook in which she recorded bids and prices and the condition of lots she wanted to track. She had been doing this for 9 years, and her notebook was a record of 9 years of Redbud County sales, a document of prices and patterns that she had been keeping for her own reference, and that represented the kind of knowledge that could not be purchased or transferred. It had to be built through attendance sale by sale over 9 years. James Treadwell was at the consignment desk when the sale started, watching his morning lot come in at the number his cattle always brought when they were in the morning slot, and the full room was bidding. He had been selling at this barn for 22 years. His cattle had a reputation that was built over 22 years of consistent quality, and the reputation was the thing that made the price, and the price required the morning room to be real, and the morning room required his cattle to be in the morning sequence. He watched them come through. He nodded once when the gavel came down at a number he recognized. That was the right number. He had known that number for years. Laura Washington, who had not known that her lot sequencing had been altered and had not filed a complaint, received a call from Gerald Farr on the Friday before the sale and was told what the review had found and what the settlement would be. She said, "I thought I was just having a bad run of sales." Gerald said no. It was not that. She said, "I did not know I could file a complaint about something like that." He said, "You can." "You always could." She said, "How would I know to do that?" He said, "That is something we are going to make clearer." She said, "Yes, make it clearer." Marlene was at the kitchen table when he got home from the sale. She had been following the situation since February and had asked him specific questions throughout and had listened to his answers with the thoroughness she brought to everything she paid attention to. She had 32 years of school administration behind her, which was a career in which the person who filed a complaint was rarely the person who saw the outcome, and she understood what it meant to file something and not know whether it produced any result. She had watched Ezra go through February and March and April with the specific patience he applied to anything that required patience, which was everything he did, and she had said at one point in March, "You know, this is going to take time." He had said, "I know." She had said, "And you are going to keep going to the sale?" He had said, "Yes." "I am going to keep going to the sale." She had said, "Yes." "Of course you are." She was at the kitchen table with coffee when he got home from the first sale after the changes. She said, "How did it go?" He said the way it should have been going since January. She said, "Calvin Obie." He said, "Morning slot." His cattle. The room knew them. The price was right. She said, "And Treadwell." He said, "Morning lot." The number was what it should have been. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You did a thing." He said, "I asked a question." She said, "You asked the question that made all the other questions possible." He said they had already asked their own questions. They had filed their own complaints. I asked whether anyone had read the complaints together. She said, "That is still a thing." He said, "Yes, that is still a thing." Ezra told Dale Whitmore about the 5th paragraph on the drive back from that first sale after the changes. Dale had not come to many sales. He came for the annual sale of Coldwater Creek's yearling steers, the big sale of the year, but the regular buying and selling he left to Ezra. Ezra had called him on the drive back. Dale said the 5th paragraph. Ezra said it asked whether the prior complaints had been read together. Dale said, had they? Ezra said no. They had all been answered individually, the same way. A note saying the matter was under review. No action. 4 complaints, 4 identical non-responses. Gerald Farr did not know that until I asked the question. Dale said so asking the question was the thing. Ezra said asking the question was the thing that made the answer possible. It is like buying cattle. You can look at one animal and see one animal. You can look at 20 animals in sequence and see the pattern of what the rancher has been doing for 5 years. The pattern is the information. One complaint is one complaint. 4 complaints are a different thing entirely. Dale said you have been doing this a long time. Ezra said 41 years. You learn what to look at. He had learned it from cattle. He had learned it from his grandfather, who had said, look at the whole herd before you look at any one animal. The herd tells you things the animal cannot tell you alone. The animal tells you the rest. You need both. You can spend an hour looking at one animal and miss the thing that the herd has been telling you for the past 20 minutes if you had only been looking at the herd. His grandfather had been talking about livestock. But the principle was the same across a wide range of applications, and Ezra had been applying it for 41 years. His grandfather had also said, write down what you see, not what you think. What you see. The interpretations can change, but the observations do not lie to you. His grandfather had kept a small notebook in his front pocket every day from the time he was 18 years old until the day he died at 82, and the notebooks were in a wooden box in Ezra's spare room. 64 of them, the writing in them small and precise, and built up over 64 years. Ezra had not started keeping his own notebooks until he was 23, and he had always considered that a 9-year deficit he had not fully made up. He wrote down what he saw. He had written down what he saw at the Redbud County sale in February and March and April, and he had organized his observations into the 5-paragraph complaint, and the 5th paragraph had done the work. He had applied it on a Tuesday evening in April to a complaint about a sale barn in the hill country of central Texas, and the 5th paragraph had done the work. Calvin Obie called him after the sale. He called from the parking lot before he had driven home, which Ezra recognized as the call of a man who had something to say and did not want to wait. Calvin said morning slot. Ezra said yes. Calvin said 14 years. They always knew what those cattle were worth. You know what my morning slot average was before January. Ezra said I saw it in the consultant's report. Calvin said 14 years of that average, and then 4 months of afternoon slot numbers. The cattle did not change. The room changed. Ezra said yes. That is what the record shows. Calvin said, now it is in the record. Ezra said, yes, it is in the record now. Calvin was quiet for a moment. He said, I want to know how you wrote that 5th paragraph. What did you know when you wrote it? Ezra said, I knew I had been in the outer rows for 4 sales while other established buyers had their usual seats. I knew you had filed a complaint in February. I did not know about Dorothy or Treadwell. But I had been sitting in that barn for 8 years, and I know what a full room does to a price, and I know what a thin room does to a price, and when I sat in the outer rows for 4 sales and could not do my job at the level I know how to do it, I thought, if this is happening to me, it is most likely happening to others. The 5th paragraph asked whether anyone had checked. Calvin said I should have asked that. Ezra said you filed the complaint in February. You were the first. Your complaint was in the record when I filed mine. Without your complaint in February, mine does not say 4 complaints. It says 1. And 1 complaint about a processing delay is not the same thing as 4 complaints about a pattern. Calvin said I did not know that. Ezra said, now you do. Calvin said, how do you put it in the form that requires the answer? Ezra said you ask whether the prior complaints have been reviewed in sequence or individually. You are asking a yes or no question that makes the reviewer go look. If they go look, they will find what is there. Calvin said I will use that. Ezra said yes. Use it. James Treadwell found him in the parking lot after the sale and shook his hand. He was 66 years old and had been selling cattle at this barn for 22 years, and he was not a man who expressed things with a lot of words, and what he said was morning lot. Ezra said yes. Treadwell said there it is. That was all he said. That was enough. Dorothy Reyes called on the Monday after the sale. She said the auction felt different. Ezra said it was different. She said it felt like the barn again. The one I have known for 9 years. The one where I know what my cattle are going to bring before they come through because I know this room, and this room knows my cattle. That is what it felt like today. Ezra said yes. Dorothy said Gerald Farr stood at the podium and said what he said. That took something. Ezra said yes. It took something. Dorothy said, I want to know how you thought to ask about the prior complaints in that 5th paragraph. I have filed complaints before in my life at other places about other things, and I have never thought to ask that question. Ezra said you look at the herd before you look at any one animal. 1 complaint tells you about 1 animal. 4 complaints tell you about the herd. Dorothy said I want to remember that. Ezra said you will. Use it when you need it. Dorothy said I will. And when I do, I will think about this barn and this sale and Calvin Obie's morning slot cattle and what 14 years of the right price is supposed to look like. Ezra said yes. That is the right thing to think about. Dorothy said thank you. He said Calvin was first. He is the one you thank first. He drove to the ranch on a Thursday morning in June and got out of the truck and looked at the hill country spread out in every direction. The grass was good after a wet May, and the herd was in good shape. The Angus cattle doing what they did on good grass on a clear morning, moving slowly across the pasture in the specific unhurried way that meant everything was as it should be. Ezra had stood in fields like this one for 50 years, and he could read a pasture the way other people read a room, which was quickly and completely and without having to name what he was seeing. Dale Whitmore was on the porch with coffee, which was where he usually was when Ezra arrived at the ranch in the mornings. Dale was not an early riser by inclination, but the ranch had made him one by necessity, and he had developed over 19 years the habit of the porch coffee and the first look at the weather and the pasture, though his look at the pasture was less informed than Ezra's, and he knew it. He said, "How do things look?" Ezra said, "Good. The grass is good. The herd is good. We will have a strong yearling class in the fall," Dale said. and the sale barn. Ezra said the morning slot cattle are in the morning slot. The buyers know who they are. The room does what a full room does. Dale said Gerald Farr said what he said before the sale. Ezra said yes. Dale said that took something. Ezra said it did. Dale said, "Do you think it sticks?" Ezra said the new procedures are in writing now. The threshold for sequential review is in writing. The lot sequencing criteria are in writing. The buyer registration criteria are in writing. The things that are in writing can be enforced and audited and reviewed. The things that were not in writing could be applied at personal discretion and were. So I think it sticks as long as the writing is enforced. Dale said you put the writing in motion by asking for the complaints to be read together. Ezra said I put the question. The question produced the answer. The answer produced the writing. That is how it works. Dale said you have been doing this a long time. Ezra said 41 years. He walked out to the pasture after the coffee. He walked the perimeter of the east section the way he walked it every week, looking at the fence, looking at the grass, looking at the cattle as he moved. He was looking at individual animals and at the herd at the same time, which was the thing his grandfather had taught him you had to be able to do simultaneously. You looked at the herd to see the pattern. You looked at the animal to see the individual. Both were necessary, and they informed each other, and neither alone was enough. He had been doing this for 41 years. He had looked at a lot of herds. He had looked at a lot of individual animals within herds. He knew the difference between an animal that was having a bad day and a herd that had a problem. He knew that you had to see both to understand either. The fifth paragraph had been about the herd. The herd had a problem. The problem was now in the record, and the record was now the thing that would protect the next person who drove to the Redbud County Livestock Auction on a Thursday morning with cattle worth what they had always been worth, and took the seat they had always had, and let the room do what rooms did when the process was fair. Laura Washington, who had not known she could file a complaint about lot sequencing, knew now. Dorothy Reyes had the herd principle. Calvin Obie knew that the first complaint counted, and that filing it was not nothing even when the individual response was inadequate because the complaint was in the record, and the record was the thing that made 4 complaints possible instead of 1. He picked up his pace slightly on the back fence line, which was his habit on the return leg of the walk. He could see the truck from here and the porch where Dale had gone back inside. The cattle moved in the morning light. They moved the way good cattle moved without hurry, with the specific ease of animals in a familiar place on a good grass day. He knew their weights from the field. He knew what they would bring in the fall when the yearling class came through the ring at Redbud County on a Thursday morning with the full room and the right lot sequence and the price that was the right price. He had always known what they would bring. He knew now that the barn would give them what they were worth. That was the thing that had been in question since January, and that was not in question anymore. The question had been asked. The answer was in the records. The records were the thing that made it possible to hold the answer to account. His grandfather had kept records for 64 years. He kept records. Calvin Obie would keep his own records differently now, knowing that a complaint was not just a complaint, but a data point in a larger record that needed to be read alongside other data points to say what it actually meant. Laura Washington would keep records. Dorothy Reyes had 9 years of notes in small notebooks that were the record of what this barn had been before January, and that documented what it was supposed to be. The record was the thing. The record made the 5th paragraph possible. The 5th paragraph made the sequential review possible. The sequential review made everything else possible. He had always known what his cattle would bring. He knew now that the barn would give them what they were worth. That knowledge was in the record. The record had been built by 4 complaints and 1 5th paragraph and 1 consultant and 1 barn owner who had stood at the podium and said what he said. All of those things were in the record now, and the record was the thing that made it possible for the next rancher who drove to this barn with cattle worth morning slot prices to get morning slot prices, without knowing that someone had filed a complaint about a registration hold in February, and someone had written a 5th paragraph asking whether the prior complaints had been read together, and someone had stood in a field in Grady County at 14 years old with a man who said, "Look at the whole herd first. You need to see the pattern before you see the animal. The animal is only part of the story." He had known that for 50 years. He had used it once in a complaint, and the complaint had done what complaints do. When they ask the right question at the right moment, it had produced the answer that the individual questions had not been able to produce alone.